Okay, in this video, we want to start working on creating a blog post. So let's just start by logging in, since only authorized users can create a resource, or in this case, a blog post. So first, we want to create a page for our create form. Let's go back to our project in the source folder and then app. I'm going to create a new folder. I would call it posts. And within that, I will have another folder. I would call it create. And within the create folder, I will have my page.jsx. And in here, of course, we want to export default async function, and we would call this create. We don't need any parameters. And for now, let's just return an h1, for example, that says create. So notice I'm creating a folder called posts and then create. So that means we have to go to /posts and then /create to get to this page. Let's see if it works. So in our browser, I can say posts /create, and there we go, we have our text. Next, we want to create a link for it here in the auth section of our navigation. So let's open navigation.jsx. And again, this is the auth section. We already have two items. Let's copy the dashboard link. Above that, so that would be our first link, we will have our new post link. So the href for this one should be /posts /create. And back to the website, we are on this page and we can see the link which is active. Now let's work on our form. Back to page.jsx under posts create, we want to return a bit of markup here. So let's add the parentheses and start with the div. And we want to add the container class and also set the width to half. Within that, we will have an h1 with the class title. And I would just say create a new post. Now down here, we want to have our form, but because I want to use the same form for the update, I want to make this into a component so I don't have to repeat myself. Let's do this now. In the components folder, I'm going to create a new document, and I would call this post form, or maybe a blog form. Maybe that would be a better name. So blog form.jsx, and let's say export default function and call it blog form. And we need the props, but for now, let's leave it empty. And let's return a div that says form, and we will come back to it in a moment, but let's import it first on our page. Back to the create page, we want to import our blog form and just self-close it like this. And it is imported up here. And if we go back to our website, we can see the form text. All right, so now let's go back to this blog form component and create an actual form. So instead of this div, I will just have a form tag. Then I'm going to copy one of those input fields from the login page. So in our login component, I'm just going to copy this div and paste it here in the blog form component. And of course, we want to change a few things. So for our blog posts, I just want to have a title and a body. So the label should say title. For the input field, we want type text. The name should be title. And we don't need the default value just now. We don't have enough data. So let's remove that. And I'm going to comment out this error state. So it will not give us any error. This is our first input field. Let's copy this, paste it underneath. We don't need this input field. We want a text area. So let's delete this. For the label, we want to say HTML for content, and the label should say content. Then we want a text area. The name should be content. We don't need an ID, but I will add the rows, which I will set it to 6. And we can delete this error state, and later on we will get it from up here. And after that div for the text area or the content area, let's have a button. And I want to say submit here to keep it generic because we will reuse this form. Let's also add the class btn-primary here. And back to the website, here is our form. We just have to add a bit of a space between the elements, and we can do that by going to the form tag and add the class name and say a space y4. And there we go. This is our form. So we are done with the form, and we want to create a server action for it to submit the data that we get from the form to our database. So the process is going to be the same as login and register. We need validations, then we need to check a few things and then submit the data. So let's start by creating our rules for the blog form. Let's open rules.js. And at the bottom of this document, let's create another schema. So we want to say export const, and I will call this blog post schema. We will use the same schema for update and create. We will set this to Z from Zod, which is already imported in this document, and we want to use the object, and then in an object we want to define our rules for different properties. So we have a title, we want to say this must be a string. Let's add the minimum function so it cannot be empty, and we want to say 1 and then an object for the message. So for the message, I would just say title field is required. Then we want to use the max method. So I don't want to have a title that is longer than 100 characters. So I can say 100 here. And again, I want a message. So let's copy this and paste it here. And for the message, I want to say title can't be more than 100 characters. And lastly, we want to trim the white space. So I forgot the dot. There we go. So we have these rules for our title. Let's add a comma and do the same thing for our content property. I think we can copy all of this and paste it here, but we don't need the max value since this is the body of our post. So we just need a string, min, and trim. And let's also change this to content. So content field is required. And that is our blog post schema. And we can close this document. Next, we want to go back to our actions folder and create a new document, which I would call it posts.js. So first, let's say use server and then create our function. Let's say export async function. I would call this create post. And since we are going to work with forms, let's accept state and form data. And then let's create our title variable. We will set this to form data get title and just duplicate this, change the title property to content, and then I will log them into the console. All right, so this is our create post server action. Now we need to go back to our blog form and tell our form to use that action. So remember, we are still inside this blog form component, not on the page. So first, let's grab the state action and is pending. We will set this to use action state from React. So make sure you import that. And the first argument is going to be the action. Now, we don't want to say create post directly because again, this is a component and we want to reuse it. But what we could do is to accept props. So I'm going to accept a prop called handler, and that would be the action for the form. So whatever action we pass down to this handler prop, it would be the action of our form. So that's the first argument. And then we want to pass undefined as a second argument. And now we have access to state, action, and is pending. So let's use them on our form, similar to register and login form. So for the action, we want to use action, which is this one, which corresponds to the handler, and that is going to be either create or update a blog post. Then we can bring back this error state because now we have access to it, and we want to say if we have a title error, then show that under the title field. Same thing for the content. So we can copy this and paste it here. Under the text area, we just have to change the property name to content. And we also have the is pending property. So let's bind that to the disabled attribute of our button. And lastly, let's make the text dynamic. And we can say if is pending is true, then render loading ... Otherwise, render submit. All right, so that is our form component. We still have to add one last thing, and that is the directive use client, because we are using the use action state hook, which is a client-side function. So make sure you add use client at the top of this blog form component. And now our blog form, which is being imported on the create page, is expecting a handler prop. So let's go back to the page and say handler. And now the value of this is going to be our create post server action. So let's use that here. And of course, we need to import that from our server actions. All right, let's see if this works. If we go back to our website and give it a reload and add something to the title and the content, press submit, and then go back to the terminal. Right here, we can see that title and the content was logged into the console. So we are able to get the form data and pass it down to our server action, which we are calling it create post. So I added these comments that are the steps we need to take. First, we need to check if the user is signed in, because if they're not signed in, we don't want to submit anything to our database. So let's do that first, and this is similar to what we did on the navigation to get the authenticated user. Let's create a user variable, and I will set this to await get auth user. We created this function in the previous videos, and all it does, it reads from our cookies and checks if the JSON Web Token is valid or not. If that is valid, it will give us a user, but if it is not, it will be undefined or null. So we want to check. If the user is null, then we will return a redirect to maybe homepage or the login page. So let's say homepage. And that is the first step. If the user is not logged in, they would not be able to perform any action. And of course, we will protect the route before even this kicks in using a middleware, but we want to be extra careful and not allow any actions if the user is not logged in. Then we want to validate our form fields. So we are already grabbing them right here from our form, and we just have to use our blog post schema to validate these fields. So let's create a validated fields variable, and we will set this to blog post schema. So again, make sure it is imported from the rules document. And then we want to use the safe parse and pass an object. And the values we want to use is this title and the content. So we can just say title and content like that. The next step is to check if this validated fields pass or fail. So let's add an if statement and negate the condition and say if validated fields dot success was false, then return an object where we have the errors, and the value of that is going to be validated fields dot error dot flatten dot field errors. So we will return the errors back to the component if there is any, but if there isn't, we will try to save that into the database. So we will get to this in a moment. Let's go back to the browser and give it a reload. If we press submit without adding anything, then we get our error messages. So that is working. If I add a text here that is more than 100 characters, so I'm just pasting a lot of characters and press submit, we can see the title can't be more than 100 characters, but at the same time, you notice we are losing the data again. And I think in such forms like a blog post, we don't want to clear the form. So let's actually return that with the error messages. So in this object where we are returning the errors, let's also return title and content. So we can keep the data on the form even if there is an error. Let's go back to the blog form, and on this input field, which belongs to the title, we want to provide the default value attribute and set this to state dot title. So if we have a title, we will keep that as the default value. Then let's copy this and paste it for the text area. So we want to say keep the content as the default value even if there is an error. So now if we go back to the website and add something, but not for the content, and press submit, we can see that there is an error, but we don't lose this data. And of course, it works the other way around as well. All right, so now all is left is to submit the data to our database. So after the validations check, we want to have a try catch block and try to submit the data to our database. Let's create a new variable, and I would call this post collection. So remember, in the previous videos, when we were working with the authentications, we created our users collection, and now we are creating a new one, calling it posts. So let's set this to await and get collection. That is a function we defined in our DB document. And this is looking for a collection name, so we can call it whatever we want. But I would call this posts, and this will get our posts collection, or if it doesn't exist, it will create one and then it will retrieve it. Now we want to insert a document into this collection. So let's create a new variable, and I will call it post. That would represent one single object, and then we will set this to an object. And here you can add the fields for your blog post or any resource you want to add. So in our project, we have a title, and the value of this is gonna be from validated fields data.title. Then I'm going to duplicate this, change the property name to content, and then we need a third field, and that is the user ID, because we want to know who created this post. And of course, if we don't have a user in the first place, then we don't get into any of this. Now, before actually passing down the user ID, let's just add an empty string here and go back to the top of our function. So before all of this, I'm just going to log that user into the console once again. We did this in the previous video, but I want to show you again, what does this user give us? So I'm going to add a return statement so none of this would happen. And let's go back to the website and just press submit. And back to the terminal, you can see we get an object where the user ID is a string. So we need to keep that in mind. Let's go back to the project and remove these two lines. I just wanted to show you what does that user give us. And down here, we don't want to say user.user ID like this, which refers to this value. But we want to convert this into an object ID, which is part of MongoDB. To do that, we can use the object ID from MongoDB. So make sure we import this from MongoDB, and then we can use the method create from hex string to create an object ID. So this is looking for a hex string, and that must be a 24-character string. And this is where we want to use this user ID, which is our 24-character string. So this will turn the string into an object ID, and then we will set that as the value for our user ID. So this is the document we want to insert into our post collection. So let's await for the post collection, then use the insert one method, which is looking for the document or an object. In this case is our post. We could, of course, pass this object directly to here, but I just wanted to keep this a bit organized. So this will try to add this new resource to our database, but if it fails, we want to return an error. And let's return an object here. We will put this under the errors and then title. And let's show the error.message. We could either show the error message from this object right here, or we could just have our own custom message and say, for example, failed to connect to the database or something like that. So at the very end, if everything works properly, we want to redirect the user back to their dashboard. So let's use the redirect function, and we want to say go to dashboard. So we've already imported redirect up here, so we don't have to worry about that. And that's all we have to do to create a new blog post in our database. So let's test this out first, and then we will come back and have a quick recap. Back to the website, of course, we are logged in, so we can see this page, we can submit it, and we get the errors. But let's log out first, and then manually go to posts.create. So we can see this page, of course, because we still don't have any middleware, but we shouldn't be able to submit this form. Let's see what happens if we press submit. We are redirected back to the home page, so nothing happens. And that is where this checks comes in. So we know that is working. Let's actually log in now. And we are redirected to the dashboard. We want to go to the new post, and let's say my new blog post. And I'm just going to take some lorem text from this website and paste it here and press submit. We are redirected to the dashboard. We didn't get any errors. That means we should have a new collection in our database. So back to MongoDB, if we press refresh up here, we have our new posts collection. And right here, we have our new object. So we have the ID, which is an object ID. We have the title, the content, and also the user is an object ID, which corresponds to our users table and this user who created that post. So we were able to successfully create a blog post and save it in our database. Let's have a quick recap before ending this video. We created a form, just like the previous videos with login and register, but this time, because we want to make the form reusable, we created a component for it. And we just made the action of our form dynamic, and we passed that down as a prop to our form. Then in our server action, which would save the blog post in our database, we first check if the user is logged in. Otherwise, we would redirect him to the home page. Then we created a new schema for our blog posts and checked if the form data passes those validations. And if that was true, then we would get our posts collection from our database, create a new document with a user ID, and submit that to our post collection. And of course, at the end, we redirect the user to the dashboard. So now we are done with this video and creating a new resource. In the next one, we will see how we can populate our homepage with the resources we have in our database.